Good morning, all. We are right at time, so we're gonna get started. Thanks for joining us this morning for Mass Creative's virtual policy and action update. It's Friday, October 16th. I'm here. I'm Emily Ruddick, Executive Director, and I'm here with G. Quash, our Director of Engagement and Organizing. And let's get started. So I'm hoping I take very little time to talk about maybe one of the more frustrating items, which is the federal fourth stimulus bill. So here is literally the latest, as in this morning, the update. So Trump wants more than 1.8 trillion, which is what he and Mnuchin had originally suggested. The House wants 2.2 trillion. And the Senate this morning, or yesterday, Senate Majority Leader McConnell said the Senate might do 500 billion. So these numbers are nowhere near close, though Trump seems to be very interested in lobbying the Senate hard to do a stimulus bill as soon as possible. I think the reality is that there's very little chance of a fourth stimulus bill before November 3rd, but these things kind of keep happening, and they do matter in terms of what we're thinking about on the state level, which is why I bring it up. So I wish I had better news, but here's where we are. So now moving along to the state. So the big thing that happened this week is that Baker released a revised budget proposal. Now remember, this is a proposal, and in a sort of traditional year, he makes his proposal in January, then the legislature takes it up, the House does their first pass at it, where they have a draft, they have amendments, they pass a version, the Senate has a draft, they have amendments, then the two chambers of the legislature have to reconcile the differences in the two versions that they passed. It goes to Baker's desk or the governor's desk, where he can sign the whole thing, do line item vetoes, or do a pocket veto where he just runs out the clock. And then if he does any vetoes, then the legislature has to vote to override him, or override those vetoes or not. So that's a normal year. We're not in a normal year. So he released a revision of his January proposal. Here's just sort of like the big highlights. It is 45.5 billion more than his proposal in January. And where is he getting that money? So he's identifying, he and Secretary Heffernan, who's Secretary of Administration and Finance, have identified that there is 834 million in Medicaid reimbursements where they're going to put some of that money or get some of that money. And then there's 1.35 billion from the rainy day fund. The majority of increases are really along health and human services, and specifically in mass health. Right? And that probably comes as no surprise to anyone. We have seen how the strong connection between employment and health insurance has caused significant problems in this moment when we're dealing with a national health crisis and an economic crisis. So that's where a lot of the money is going. But for the purposes of this call and our arts and cultural advocacy, I just want to point out a couple items to watch. So the Mass Cultural Council budget is at 16.3 million. That's the same as January. Folks, this is actually a real relief. Like 20 pounds lifted off my shoulders when I saw this, because he's not suggesting any cuts from his January version. And as we know, this is sort of the first pass at this. And traditionally, Baker always has a lower number for the Mass Cultural Council budget than is eventually arrived at with the House and the Senate. So this puts us in a really great sort of negotiating position, especially in a year when we were sort of bracing ourselves for having to see a lot of more deeper cuts. There's also increased money for small business technical assistance grants, as well as regional economic development grants. I bring these up, sorry about the bing. I bring these up because these are places where we should be starting to watch and pay attention and find opportunities for us as leaders in the arts and cultural space to think about how are we part of small business conversations? How are we part of regional economic development efforts? Okay. Then the Mass Office of Tourism and Travel has a very meager budget. It hasn't changed since January. And then finally, Chapter 78, which is sort of a long historic program to bring up education spending for cities and towns was at 5.3 billion. That's more than it was in fiscal year 20, but it's a little less than the January recommendation. So these are all the things that we're tracking and will continue to track. Then I want to talk a bit about what's missing. So there's two big things for my money and I think for us as arts advocates that we should be paying attention to. One is Baker is proposing a postponement of a year of the implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. You can read more about what the Student Opportunity Act means in terms of increased funding for schools and school districts. And that matters to us because we know that when there is less money in schools and school districts, the arts are on the top of the chopping block. And we believe that every student, regardless of zip code or school district, deserves a quality arts educational experience in their curriculum from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade and beyond. The other piece that I want to just track is that he's suggesting we postpone the state charitable giving deduction that was supposed to go into effect this year. So 10 years ago, there was a huge tax reform. And part of it was saying when a number of circuit breakers or sort of mile markers had been met, the state would put into place a state level charitable giving deduction. And now for any of you on this call who do any sort of fundraising, you know how helpful bringing up charitable deductions can be when you're talking to major donors or donors in general. And so this would put it off by at least a year. We'll continue to track these. These are things that we care about. In the chat, you'll also see more information about that charitable giving deduction from our friends at the Mass Nonprofit Network. So moving along. So what's next in this really unusual year? So next Wednesday, the House and Senate Ways and Means Committee is going to have an invite-only hearing where they are literally inviting folks to present testimony. It's going to be Wednesday. When we get a link to that, we will include it in our Monday follow-up from this call in case you want to watch it. But I think we're going to learn more about sort of the position of the legislature in this whole conversation. Senator Roderick's went on record to say that the plan is to pass a budget over the next few weeks, and Baker wants to see the passed budget on his desk before Thanksgiving. And so remember, they got to pass it. Both chambers have to pass it. Then it's got to go into conference committee and get revoted on before it gets to Baker's desk. Or they could do something different, right? And I've talked about this on a couple of other calls. They could do a pre-conferenced bill, which basically means that the House and the Senate have already leadership has already sort of hashed through the major roadblocks and they're going through the process. But the hope is that it's a much quicker process in order to make sure that, that we can get a budget put out there. So this is a very unusual year. And so it means a very unusual advocacy schedule. In the chat box, you should see a link to the Mass Cultural Council's statement on Governor Baker's budget proposal. And so we will be working quite closely with our partners at Mass Cultural Council and Mass Humanities to make sure that you have the right information and know when the most useful and strategic time for any outreach and advocacy to your elected officials would be. For right now, we're still trying to get a lay of the land, so we'll learn this together. So next, I want to talk about another piece of legislation that is really important, I think, not just for the creative community, but for the communities that we serve. So early on in the pandemic, the legislature passed and Governor Baker signed into law a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures so that folks who would not be homeless in the midst of a public health pandemic. So the period which that piece of legislation covered ends on Saturday. Now, there was an option built into that piece of legislation that Baker could opt to extend it if he so desired desired. And Baker has declined to extend the moratorium. Instead, he has put together an eviction diversion plan that, among many things, includes 170 million in rental assistance. Yesterday, Representative Mike Conley from Cambridge attempted to get an emergency petition passed through the House. It was referred to Joint Committee on Housing, and because the Senate wasn't in session, the Senate wasn't able to concur, and neither are in session today. So it is that there is no emergency petition before Saturday's deadline. Obviously, I think housing advocates and the ones that we follow and work to support, both City Life Vita Urbana and then Citizens Housing and Planning Association, or CHAPA, have been working really diligently on this. And City Life Vita Urbana has some resources, which are in the chat box and the link, about what to do if you're facing eviction. If you are on this call and you are concerned about your housing stability, I heartily encourage you to check out those resources. I would also say that this is something to share with our creative networks, right? Housing is an arts issue, just like food is an arts issue. And work is an arts issue. So this is something that we're going to continue to follow, and we encourage you to pay attention to as well. And then CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, has a number of housing policy items to just check out if you want to learn more about this. But as things continue, we'll continue to pay attention to this. And we feel pretty strongly that this is a place where we need to support our fellow advocates. So we will be doing that. So now I want to talk about voting. So we are 18 days out from the election, and early voting begins tomorrow, excuse me. So for those of you on the call, I know that some of you have already mailed in your ballot. I'm so delighted to hear that. For others of you, you are maybe requesting your ballot or waiting for your ballot, or are beginning to think about where are you going to go vote in person early. So I heartily encourage you to make your voting plan. The other thing I would say is that it's not just about making a plan to vote. It's also, it's not just about going to vote. It's about taking a look and reviewing the sample ballot before you go into that voting booth, and making sure that you have taken a minute to see everybody who's going to be on that ballot. We know that local elections matter just as much as who is running for president and who wins the presidency. And so this is our responsibility to make sure that we're taking a look at all the way down that ballot. So we encourage you to make that plan and make that part of your plan. I want to talk very briefly about something I'm really excited about. So in past years, we have held a one-day online day of action and visibility for arts and culture called Arts Matter. We are changing that this year. So we are broadening it to a year-round messaging campaign called Arts and Culture for Mass. And so the intention really is that our work to make sure that folks understand how important arts and culture and the people who make art and culture in Massachusetts and their relationship to their neighborhoods and their communities is lifted up and made visible throughout the year. So we're going to start with some stories with some partners that we've been working with a little bit on this on October 23rd. October 23rd. But moving forward and starting in January, we're really hoping to actually theme things from month to month. And we are looking for more partners. So in the chat box, you should see a link to learn more about this campaign. And you should email G if you want to get involved, because we want to get as many people involved as possible. If you have already planned a celebration on October 23rd, which would traditionally be the day for Arts Matter Day, that's great. And we can't wait to see what's going to happen and what our larger creative community has put together. We just ask that in addition to whatever hashtags you'd like, you include one of these hashtags: Artworks for Mass, Arts Ed for Mass, Creativity Connects for Mass. We know that our sector is diverse and isn't just about art, it's about art and culture, art and arts education. And so we want to lift all of those stories up. And then finally, on October 23rd, we are going to hold, as part of our Create the Vote work, a webinar called What Happens After November 3rd. And so this is really a conversation about, regardless of who takes control in Washington of the White House, the Senate, and the House, we know that there is real work that we need to continue to do as arts and cultural advocates on the federal and state level. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what we can expect, where are the places and opportunities for advocacy. And we have some really great speakers lined up. I'm really excited to tell you all, you're the first people to hear this, that Attorney General Maura Healey will actually be giving a keynote address to start us off for this webinar. I think Attorney General Healey has really shown how advocacy and sustained advocacy, both in terms of policy change as well as legal change, makes a difference in our lives. And so I'm really glad to have her join us for this event. But then we're going to hear from folks who are doing arts and creativity, art advocacy through the Sunrise Movement. We're going to hear from arts leaders in terms of how they've thought about incorporating art advocacy into their work and their organizations. So I'm super excited to have this, to put this panel together. You can see a link in the chat box to register, and we're going to be obviously talking a lot about this next week as well. So that is my update for this week. As always, we hope you will continue to join us. Our next update will be Friday, October 30th, so the day before Halloween. Please do not come in costume. But I am so glad to have this time with you all and to give you this update. We're working really hard to make sure that you have the information to be as effective in your advocacy as possible. So as always, if you have questions or you want more details, feel free to give me a shout and continue on. Thank you for your partnership. We hope you have a good weekend. The leaves outside my window continue to be beautiful as they turn. So I hope we all get a chance to get outside this weekend. Thanks and have a great day.